to the final education panel of Texas Public Policy Foundation's Policy Orientation 2013. This is the Classroom of the Future, Improving Learning Through Technology. My name is James Golsan. I am the Education Policy Analyst here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And I want to keep my opening comments as brief as possible. We have a really excellent panel of experts today. I want to give them as much time as I possibly can. But this is an area that these learning technologies are something we've been researching here at the foundation really with a lot of energy over the last couple of years. Namely, to my mind, on the one hand, there's a compelling argument for efficiency in these technologies, that you can educate a body of students for less using learning technologies. But more importantly, I think, is that we have a very large and extremely diverse student population here in Texas. And I don't just mean diverse in terms of socioeconomic. I also mean we have very, very large cities, Houston and Dallas, but we also have incredibly rural areas in Texas. And as important as it is that we bring reforms like school choice to Texas, if you're living in a community that's 100 miles from the nearest town, a voucher impact might not, or the impact of, let's say, a new voucher program or a new tax credit program might not have as immediate an impact on you, simply because it's not geographically feasible for a student in that area to attend another school. And that, among others, which our panelists will outline, is where we see a lot of potential for digital learning in this state. Really, not only to diversify and improve the classroom experience of all of our students, but to especially reach out to our rural students and give them some opportunities that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have if limited to just the classroom in their hometown. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Susan Patrick. She is the president and CEO of the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. They're a group with more than 3,800 members, including school districts, charter schools, and state education agencies. She is also the former director of the Office of Education Technology at the U.S. Department of Education. Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Patrick.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here back in Texas today. I work with all 50 states, and we work with a number of countries internationally. The nonprofit that I work for is based in the Washington, D.C. area. We do have a focus on state policy, quality standards for new learning models, as well as helping districts, schools, even charter schools on the ground, a number of universities working in this space too. So I've got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to go pretty quickly because I found when I used to work for Governor Hull in Arizona, you had a pretty good idea of what was happening in your own district or your own state, but to try to give you a global perspective on what the classroom of the future looks like and what's happening both internationally, our kids are going to have to be prepared for the workforce in a globally competitive environment. Other countries are moving very quickly to try to scale up a world-class education for every child. Across the U.S., sometimes when I get on the airplane and I come back home and I see the kinds of debates that are taking place in this country, it's a little bit concerning. And so I'm going to walk through real quickly both a global perspective and a national perspective on what the future of learning looks like. We now have over 4,400 members in all 50 states working on pushing that classroom of the future to help engage students, to help give every child access to a world-class education, no matter what zip code they live in, no matter what their background. So quickly, here's an international perspective. The World Future Society is a group of researchers worldwide. The data set is actually housed at George Washington University in DC. The data set is the most accurate predictive data that they have. Over 15 years, it's been accurate 97% of the time, plus or minus 3 years. Really interesting. They're talking about the top 10 trends that will change life as we know it on this planet over the next 20 to 30 years. Some things are pretty straightforward. Number one, alternative energy. Number two, desalination of water. When I was in China, they're worried about the Yalu River drying up over the next 20 years. When I was in Jordan in the Middle East, again, they're worried about the water supply drying up. The one thing on this list that relates to education is virtual education and distance learning. Other countries are working to internationally benchmark standards digitize them and find ways to offer virtual education. Kids that never had access to education suddenly having access to the best teachers and the best internationally benchmarked content. So I'm going to walk you through. In the European Union, they've put together an EU-wide e-learning action plan. They have created competencies from pre-K through K-12 into the workforce, into higher ed, and they have these competency maps for all of the citizens. Who's familiar with the International Baccalaureate, the IB diploma program? Back in 2006, they started an IB diploma program online. They're training their best master teachers who teach in IB, same rigorous content, same standards, same requirements for fluency in multiple languages, but they moved it online. They started with 26 countries. They're now in 125 different countries, and students that had no access to IB now have access, and they have these interactive, communicative opportunities to get on Skype and communicate with kids not only in their own town or their own country, but worldwide, react to each other's ideas and discussions. The UK is really focused on thinking about education worldwide as an export. It's estimated 29 billion pounds annually in exports and education through e-learning just to China alone. So you're talking about $50 billion. Education is no longer a cottage industry worldwide. India, I was with Shantanu Prakash, who is up on the corner, back in 2006 in a conference in Beverly Hills, California, on an international panel. He was starting a project called EduComp. His challenge was a partnership with the Ministry of Education in India to digitize world-class content and curriculum, internationally benchmark it, to help bring that to students in India. In India, they have a goal to provide universal access to education to all students in the K through 12 grades. In order to do that, they would have to build 200,000 new school buildings. They don't have the money to do that. So what are they doing? They're forming community technology centers, the local schoolhouses, if you even call them schoolhouses, but they're training their best teachers to use this digital content and teach online, and they're bringing the digital content and the teaching to kids leveraging technology. So I saw Shantanu Prakash, we were on another panel at Harvard just a few months ago, and I said, how's your EduComp project going? And he said, oh, it's going really well. They've scaled up to reach 12 million kids that weren't getting education in just 6 years. And you're going to see the contrast between the ability for some of these other countries to scale up and kind of the numbers and what we're doing in the US as a comparison. So they're talking about using technology to leverage their best teachers to reach more students. So it's a different distribution model, different delivery model. The key in all of these examples are quality teachers, great teachers, being connected with kids. The other thing that happened in India around the same time, back in the mid-2006, is that the government challenged their research universities to come up with a $10 tablet, much like an iPad. They're now at the price point of about $30 per tablet, and they've deployed millions of these to students across India. About 100,000 units a month are being deployed. In Hong Kong, they have they're moving to an entirely digital curriculum, again, combining great teachers with the tools to better engage students. In South Korea, they've moved from digital content away from textbooks to try to better engage students, use adaptive learning content so students can move and accelerate at their own pace, can get extra help. They have a national virtual school. And China is really interesting. I was there with the Ministry of Education back when I was with the US Department of Ed in 2004 and 2005. They had just finished digitizing their entire K through 12 content and curriculum. They're in the process of training their master teachers to teach online. Their goal in the next 10 years is to reach 100 million more children with access to a world-class education. So The Futurist is out of the World Bank. It's a publication, and this was in 2011. China may be the first country to succeed in educating most of its population through the internet. From this period of 2003 to 2007, they spent about $1 billion to implement online learning projects in the rural countryside, and one of their number one goals is to teach all of their students to be fluent in English by the time they're in middle school. Compare that to some of our literacy numbers here in the US, where we have less than 40% of our population reading on grade level in third grade. Singapore is probably the most advanced country. They spent a lot of time coming to the US and visiting our most advanced schools like High Tech High and others in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Now, Singapore has 100% of their secondary schools using online and blended learning. Every student has a laptop or a tablet. They have plugs in their lockers. All teachers in every teacher training program are taught to teach online, and it's in the classroom. So they use the tools of online learning and digital content as a way to personalize instruction, help support students, and re-engage them. And guess what? When the kids look out the window in this country and in other countries, they see a highly connected, internet-based society, and most jobs are using some form of technology to help them, whether it's blue collar or white collar. Blended learning environments are a big focus in Singapore, and they even hold e-learning week. E-learning week is when they physically shut schools down and ensure that the teachers and the students can still learn. Why do they do this? Started back in 2003 from SARS. So what happened when H1N1 hit here in the US? If you had one student or one teacher come down with H1N1, schools shut down, right? Completely, for everyone, for 5 days. Total loss of productivity, total loss of learning. What did they do in Singapore? They have all of these classrooms of the future in their high schools, and students that don't feel well but are still well enough to learn can stay home and learn, and they have a whole ramping up, but it's a continuity of learning effort. So that's my snapshot, quick snapshot around the world. I could go through a number of other countries. Really exciting things are happening around the world. They feel the pressure of this global economy, and it's not that we're not doing a lot, it's just these other countries are really focused and actually able to move a lot faster. So when I talk about online and blended learning in the classroom of the future, I'm talking about 4 main components. Just one is the technology, it's the platform, it's the access. 2, and it's the most important, are their people. The teachers giving new pedagogical skills, new training to teach online. It blows me away that our teacher training programs are not teaching teachers to teach in online and blended environments like they are in a number of other countries right now. Our online programs here and blended programs have to completely retrain licensed teachers. Most teachers that teach in online learning environments here in the US, like for the Texas Virtual School Network, have on average at least 8 years of classroom experience. So they're seasoned professionals, they're content experts that want these new tools and new ways to connect with kids online. New assessment models, there may be embedded assessment, giving them data regularly, as well as traditional kinds of project-based assessments, performance-based assessments, essays, projects, and then of course online content, the digital content. So real quick, a national perspective, because I'm running up to the end. In 2001, the US Department of Ed reported that over half of our public school districts in the US offer at least one online course. So it's very much moving into the mainstream. Number one driver, kids that can't access courses, given opportunities to learn, to access teachers and courses they wouldn't be able to. Districts reported 1.8 million enrollments. Now, considering that the first online learning programs in the US started in Florida and Kentucky in 1996 and 97, and we've scaled up to 1.8, that's okay, but we're still reaching only a tiny bit of our population of over 50 million kids. And I'll give you an example. I don't know what the numbers are in Texas. In California, 40% of high schools do not offer the full range of A to G requirements to get into their public university system, University of California and CSU. It's kids in rural areas and from low-income areas that don't have access to a full range of advanced courses, college prep courses, and others. Universities are actually the biggest provider. People don't realize that, offering classes for kids in high school. There are for-profit vendors, and many you've heard of, and 33% of these enrollments are through state virtual schools, like you have in Texas, the Texas Virtual School Network. So there are full-time online schools in 30 states and the District of Columbia, and those circles show the relative percentage of the population that has access. In Texas, the number is pretty small. You don't have a lot of full-time online students here. And here are the state virtual schools that are in 32 different states. And you'll see Texas has 12,000 enrollments compared to, say, Florida's over 300,000 enrollments. And Senator Stevens here from Texas, from Utah, Senator Stephenson passed what I think is the most groundbreaking policy on digital learning and online learning. And you can see Utah, for a state with a much smaller population, is at 12,000 enrollments last year. And so you compare the same number of kids have access to digital online courses in Texas as they do in Utah. Utah is doing great things, but I think you have a lot of things that you can do in terms of policy here to help open up access for all kids. So I will wrap up with that and just offer my help for our nonprofit if there's anything going into the coming session that we can help with, and turn it over to Senator Stephenson. It's great to be here. Thanks.
I'm going to be talking about technology, and now I'm hoping that I will be able to not choke with the technology today. There we go. Thank you. We'll see how I do. I'm thrilled to be here in Texas, and I'm amazed at this conference that you have. I work for the Utah Taxpayers Association in my day job, and we have a conference for legislators before the session, and ours is 2 hours. The fact that you're having 3 days shows that Texas always does it bigger and better. We like to think that our economy is similar to Texas. We're kind of a mini Texas in having a good economy right now, except we don't have the accent or the swagger. But we do have some swagger about Utah's bill, which I was the sponsor of, to bring online learning to Utah. It has all 10 elements of Jeb Bush's group, which evaluates digital learning, and we have achieved all 10 of those in the first bill that we passed in Utah, so we're quite honored by that. It really does shift the paradigm. The funding follows the student to the course. This is unique. We didn't have to find new funding for this program. The problem with school reform is we often just put another layer of paint over the barnacles, another layer of funding over what we're currently doing, and we protect everything else. This takes money from every high school in the state and sends it to the online provider that the students and their parents have chosen. Every LEA, local education agency, can provide online, but most of them weren't until this bill was put in place. The funding is also based on successful completion. That is efficient, isn't it, to pay only for successful completion, 50% up front and the remaining 50% when the student shows proficiency and completion. The head of the State Teachers Union testified against the bill, as you might imagine. And when she did, she said, "Senator Stephenson, we don't think you should pay 50% up front. We think you should pay it all at the end." And I said, well, I think that model would work for bricks and mortar education as well. So I'm happy to amend the bill and do it for both. And she immediately never said anything more about that. In the second year, we amended the bill to have a tiered cost structure, because as you can understand, some classes are easier to fund, less expensive to fund than others, and we didn't want the LEAs just creaming the cheap to provide courses and leaving the science and others. And so we have these categories, and we can make these slides available to you so you can see that, and also our legislation if you're interested. Course fees. We initially in the bill we said only Utah LEAs can provide the online courses, which means the districts and the charters in Utah. And then the second year, we were going to say, we're going to let K-12 and Florida Virtual and Middlebury and others come in and compete. But they already did. The LEAs contracted with K-12. We have one district that is the contractor for K-12, one that is the contractor for Florida Virtual and Middlebury. So we didn't have to amend the bill because they were already negotiating, and the fees that they pay to Middlebury may be different than the categories that I showed you earlier. It's up to the LEA to negotiate all of that. Students customize their education with blended learning, and Susan has been great in helping to explain that already. Parents and students are in the driver's seat. They choose the courses, they choose the course providers. I have to admit to you though, quality is questionable for many of these. The districts sometimes, in order to keep kids from going elsewhere, have just built a course that may not be the kind of quality that it should be, but at least the competition is there and they are competing. All students seeking high school credits are eligible. Homeschool and private school students are eligible in year 3, beginning this year. Even if they're not in a public school, they are eligible to take these online courses and have the dollars paid from the public purse. No caps on student enrollment. Subject mastery replaces seat time. Open entry, open exit is permitted based on provider parameters, so you're not bound by the calendar of the school year. Multiple course providers and multiple courses. It's just quite incredible how we have increased the number of providers, both public and private partnerships. As I mentioned, the LEAs can contract with private providers, and it allows for growth, as any LEA can potentially qualify by creating a program to serve students exclusively online. And we have accountability for online course providers. Only LEAs that are already certified by the State Department of Education can provide it. They are the gatekeeper for the private providers. And then the program expansion. In the first year, we allowed 2 high school credits per student, and then it expands by 1 per year after that. Can you imagine a high school student who began the first time could actually graduate with 8 courses provided online, and now it will be 12 courses provided online. In the Salt Lake Tribune, they had the question that you see here, and we really have an exponential increase. In the first year the law took effect, there has been a nearly 600% increase in online learning options for Utah students in the single first year. And that's because of competition. The school districts and charter schools were fearful that students were going to take their money and go elsewhere. So they suddenly woke up and are now providing. Parents for Choice in Education is an organization that has helped us with this, and they are phenomenal and you can use them as a resource. I'd like to talk just in the couple of minutes I have left about how we can accelerate the adoption of digital learning and why. As you know, in the batch processing of kids, which we have done for the last umpteen years, we treat all kids the same, even though they are expressed in their abilities by a bell-shaped curve. You know how wide that bell-shaped curve is in a typical American classroom? It's at least 5 years wide between the top student and the bottom students. And yet we expect a teacher to stand as a sage on the stage and try to reach this 5-year wide band of abilities. It's just incredible that we're still expecting that. I remember when I was learning psychology of education in my bachelor's degree, Piaget said 80 years ago that anyone of normal intelligence can be highly proficient in math and exact science if he has immediate feedback while working the problem. And in his day, that could only be provided by a tutor. Today, it can be provided by a computer. I was in a conference in San Diego where Dr. Martha Burns spoke about brain research. And she described how intelligence is formed in the human brain. And this is groundbreaking. In order for intelligence to form in the human brain, we have to exercise agency. We have to make a choice. We have to make an attempt on individual volition. We can't do it like Pavlov's dogs in commanding learning. But when the student makes an attempt, the dendrites of the neurons reach out and connect. The only way that becomes intelligence is if we get informed as to whether our attempt was correct or incorrect. And when we do, 3 chemicals are released in the brain which seal the connection and make it permanent intelligence. One of those chemicals is dopamine, and that's why learning is joyful. When we make that attempt, get the response back, we get that dopamine release, and we find it joyful, especially when we've struggled for a little while, and then it's even more joyful. Individualized learning through digital learning provides this opportunity to adapt and to individualize learning in ways that create this joyful experience. When children are born, unlike the animal kingdom, which where those animals are able to flee from an enemy within 2 minutes or 3 minutes of birth, humans are learning creatures. And from that baby reaching out, grabbing that object and putting it in its mouth, that's the laboratory at this time, to when it reaches kindergarten, and then we command them to stop that individualized learning. You must stop. It's disruptive to my class. This is barbaric, what we're doing to kids. Through technology, we can reintroduce self-directed learning and individualized learning, and that's what Dr. Marty Burns has shown. We no longer have to accept a 73% on your final exam as acceptable, because now we can say, that's a good job, now let's do the other 27%. Proficiency should be the only standard, and it's made possible for digital learning. I'd like to tell you 2 products, just quickly, that are groundbreaking. And in the last panel, in the next room, Representative Strama was a little bit questioning about what digital learning can really do. And I brought him these 2, and after the conference, after he spoke, and I said, have you heard of these 2? He had not. And I'm going to be sharing some time with him to help him understand this. But ST Math, Matthew Peterson, you can look this up on the TED Talks. Mind Research Institute, through this computer-adapted math concept, achieved a 14% increase in California standardized test in 46 of the lowest performing elementary schools in the LA Unified School District. And I'd invite you to look at that. It is stunning what the results are. They use visual learning, and I won't go through that. Another one is English and Language Arts. Learning Oasis. These are the people who have done the Lexile scoring. I'll tell you, these kids love learning because they get what's driven to them based on their interests and their abilities. Here's the Lexile interest categories that they fill out, and then they have pushed to them in emails the kind of reading that's interesting to them, and they start reading based on what is interesting to them and what is at their Lexile score. They have been doing the research for 30 years on Lexile scores, doing evaluations of all reading material, and now you can match the kid's Lexile score to his reading ability. Jeremy Rifkin has written a book that I would commend to you, The Empathic Civilization. He has also written another bestseller, but this is an amazing book because he's done research which shows that cultures that do not have written languages are non-empathic. They view others as dinner. In order to have an empathic civilization, you have to have reading. And by reading, we vicariously experience other people's emotions. Where are there non-empathic civilizations in America, in the inner cities? Gangs are boys who are non-readers. But we have an ability through Learning Oasis to give boys the reading they want, they're interested in. And we will reinstitute this idea of empathy in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Stephenson. Our final presenter on this panel is Jennifer Berglund of the Texas Computer Educators Association. Prior to her work with the Computer Educators Association, she was the technology director, is that the correct title, at Bryan Independent School District. My alma mater. Now she has moved on to become the Director of Government Relations and Member Services for TCEA, and she's going to give us the Texas perspective on digital learning. Jennifer.
I'm very excited to be here. My association is made up of primarily Texas educators, teachers, and administrators who are interested in using technology in the classroom. We've been around for about 32 years. We do have international members as well as members from other states as well. As he said, I retired 2.5 years ago to come to Austin and continue to do what I had been doing voluntarily, which was coming over here and testifying and advocating for the use of technology in the classroom. And just to kind of give you some information, a lot of the things that I'm going to speak very quickly, just like they had to. So I have a lot of resources that I have pulled from for this presentation on a wiki. And so the URL is there. It'll be on the last slide as well. If you just Google Berglund Resources Wiki, you'll find it as well. And also, if you ever want to just follow me during this session for things that have to do with educational technology, you can follow me at TCEA Advocacy. Okay, I feel like where we're at right now, or where we've been in this move from print to digital, has been in something similar to what they would call the fog of war, which is the uncertainty of situational awareness. I think that those of us, particularly my age and maybe 10 years younger, we started with textbooks, and that's all we really knew. And all of this technology has been happening to us, but we really don't know where we're at. And I really feel like we are finally at that tipping point. And so I think the fog is beginning to clear, but I think that is part of some of when you hear people talk about, well, that's not the way I learned, those kind of things, I think it's because they're in that fog of war. So in order to clear that up, I want to talk first a little bit about the Texas perspective, and I want to start from a historical perspective. I taught U.S. history, and so, you have to kind of know where you've been to know what your challenges are now. So I'm going to very quickly go through some of the things that Texas has done to move us forward. We go all the way back to 1985 when the legislature passed House Bill 1304, which required the state to have a long-range plan for technology. And we still have one. So this has been going on. So in order to get from here to there, you have to have a plan. And so we started that in 1985. In 1992, the legislature in their wisdom knew that in order to carry out this technology plan, you had to have some funding. And so in 1992, they started the technology allotment. It was passed in Senate Bill 1, which was the budget bill. And so up until the last session, every school district received $30 a student for technology. Well, that was a lot of money in 1992. In 2012, that's not a lot of money. But these are the kinds of things that we were purchasing at that time. In the early 90s, we realized that we needed to get into distance education. And so one of the first things they did was they created the T-Star network, which was a one-way communication. When I first became a technology director, the very first thing I had to do was get one of those things, that big satellite, installed in my district, and I had no idea what that meant. Very large learning scope. And so that was the very first thing that we did, TEA, giving information to districts and educational service centers. About maybe 8 years later, they started the TETN, which was the Technology Education Network, I think is what it stood for. And it was two-way. It was video conferencing, but it did not come to districts. It came to educational service centers. So all the district personnel, if they wanted to hear from TEA directly, we had to travel to the nearest educational service center. And so that is how that got started. But the district was making movement in that direction. And then in 1995, House Bill 2128 was a telecommunication discount, it was a large telecommunication bill, overhaul the telecommunication system, and a very small part of it gave schools, libraries, and hospitals a discount for telecommunication services. And at the time, for a while, it funded some grants for school districts to do the infrastructure, put in the networks and put in the wiring, and also even buy computers and even printers. And that was it really helped move Texas forward. We still have the telecommunication discounts. It was passed in a bill last session, Senate Bill 773, extended those discounts until 2016 for schools, libraries, and hospitals. Okay, in 2001, we realized that we needed to begin to look at how can we, what would it look like if we wanted to educate a child and they were not in the same room that the teacher was. And so they passed Senate Bill 975, and that was an electronic pilot program, and it was just a kind of experiment with this whole concept of a child learning from someone at a different location. And then in 2003, they passed Senate Bill 396, which was the technology immersion pilot. And this was the project where I think around 25 districts in the state, mine was lucky enough to be one of them, received funding to provide laptops for all of your middle school students in one school. So we were experimenting with what does it look like when every kid has a computer in school. That funding lasted about 5 years. Then in 2007, Senate Bill 788 established the Texas Virtual School Network, and it actually really got off ground in 2009. So we moved from that electronic pilot to where we now have the Texas Virtual School Network. Okay, this brings me to the last two sessions. In 2009, we began to realize that we needed to do some things differently with the funding of textbooks. And one of the first things they did was they changed the phrase textbook is no longer a part of the code, instructional materials is instead, took its place. And so in 2009, they created the commissioner's list. They gave districts some flexibility to purchase items off of the state board approved list or the commissioner's list. And any money that they might have saved on doing that, they could use it on technology. This last session, they passed Senate Bill 6, and that gave districts complete flexibility with their funding for textbooks, and allowed school districts to choose the materials that they thought they needed. And then it also lumped in some funding for technology, and it eliminated the technology allotment. So where we stand now is that school districts have funding for technology through a new funding source called instructional materials allotment. I was going to go in a little bit about the net generation, but I think they did a really, really good job of that. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's important to know that the generation that we're talking about is different. And this, if you have grandchildren, you have probably experienced this. Your grandchildren are picking up their parents' iPhones or their iPads, and they're instantly going there, and they're immediately engaged with the content on these devices. When those kids get to kindergarten, they're going to expect that kind of environment when they get there. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I do want you to know that some of the 3 trends that we're seeing when we survey kids, these are the things that they're wanting. We're seeing that they're wanting mobile learning, they're wanting digital learning with e-textbooks, and they're also wanting more online learning opportunities. Just for the sake of time, I'm going very quickly. One of the things that you're hearing a lot about in your school districts is BYOT or BYOD, and that's bring your own technology or bring your own device. And a lot of school districts are beginning to embrace this, where they're allowing kids to bring their cell phones in, if they're smartphones, or their iPads, or their laptops, or their Android devices, and they're allowing them to use them in their classroom. And part of the survey that I just mentioned, it's an annual survey that is taken all across the state, all across the nation actually. It's called the Speak Up Survey. In the state of Texas, 63% of Texas parents said that if the school would allow the child to bring their own device, they would purchase them one. So that is 63% across the state. And I remember hearing Representative Scott Hochberg talk about the TIP project, and that's the one where every kid got a laptop. And he knew that in order to do that, he knew we couldn't sustain that. We didn't have the funding to provide every kid a laptop at that time. We could at $10 a device, but we couldn't at $1,000 a device. But he said if we could just figure out who we do need to purchase devices for, then maybe we could lease them and provide and loan that material, the devices to them. And now we have some hard data where we see that at least 62 or 63% of our parents indicate that they would provide the device. Now we're looking at only providing 38% of the population a loaner device. Okay, I want to get to the challenges, okay? As we see it, there are several challenges. We need more opportunities. That is one of our legislative platforms, is that we need to increase online learning opportunities in the state of Texas. Interestingly, our online learning dropped significantly, about 50% in the last year, or last 2 years, largely due, in my estimation, because of loss of funding and the way it was structured. And so that's something we need to look at, because we had reached around 22,000 in the year 2010, 2011, and then 2011, 26, it dropped around 12,000. So we are going backwards instead of going forward. Now, I haven't looked, this was data that I looked at it this summer. I haven't looked at what's going on right now, but that's something that we need to be looking at. Broadband access. This is huge. We cannot move forward if we do not provide enough broadband at school and at home. You heard our first two speakers talk about all the great things that are going on and all the great opportunities that is available online, but if the broadband is not sufficient for them to do the kinds of things that they need to do, then they're just going to give up, just like this man. It's very frustrating if you've ever had to wait for very long. And so this is something that we have to consider. CETA, which is the State Educational Technology Directors Association, recently came out with some recommendations for schools, and this is something that we have adopted. And you'll notice in 2014, 2015 school year, the target is that each school district should have 100 megs of broadband coming into the school district for every 1,000 students. To put that in perspective, right now, according to the National Broadband Map, the average of broadband that's coming into school districts is 25 megs. That's the average. So you can imagine when you have huge districts like Dallas versus small school districts like Snook, there's a lot of differences there. But we've got a long way to go. And it's important to note that it can't just be at schools, although that's where I think we ought to start, but we need to also consider our homes, particularly in rural parts of Texas. And then lastly, professional development. Susan mentioned that it's disheartening that our colleges are not really looking at this and embracing this, but this is huge. I told you I implemented one-to-one in my school district. It's probably the hardest thing I ever did. And I remember telling my school board, you know what? I'm not worried about the technical issues because money can fix that. What I am worried about is getting teachers to teach differently. And it is different. And they have to learn how to be able to manage a classroom, manage the devices. I'm not talking about the technical management, but I'm talking about leveraging that equipment so that they can really have the power of that. And so that is something that I think is that we're looking mainly at broadband access and then professional development. And I really do believe the fog is beginning to clear, I think we're realizing we need to move in that direction, and we need to solve these problems so Texas can be leading the way in all of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I just wanted to say two things very quickly. We were so pressed for time between the panels that we didn't get all the handouts out that we wanted. We will have those at the door available for you on the exit if there was not one at your seat. The second thing is that we have comment cards in all the seats. We really appreciate feedback on our panels. TPPF is always looking to get better, and we'd like to do the best job we can next year. So, first question, you, sir.
Course creation is what I do in my business. You spoke about an important point, and you alluded to it, didn't directly speak of it, and you talked about something incredibly important that needs to be addressed 5 years ago that has not been. First is that policing the content of courses. Because I see everything in professional course development from bad PowerPoint with a lot of errors that is self-testing, that the questions are so simple and so basically unpredictive of success that they're useless. So that the course itself is junk for money. And then I also see that as far as education of instructors and management of the products of technology, that there just ain't no. It just isn't handled. And you can have $1 billion worth of equipment and on a fool's errand, nothing gets done. There's no leverage of the resources to move anything forward. So I'd like to have you two, possibly, and all three of you, address those two subjects. Thank you.
You know, we are on the frontier. We haven't arrived. There's a lot of schlock stuff out there parading as quality. And that's why it's important for legislators in their role to do some of this policing. And the best way to do it, in my opinion, is by introducing competition and a market system which holds the products accountable through third-party research and then reports it. I made the mistake about 5 years ago. Remember in the days when states had surpluses? We had $60 million of one-time money that I put in educational technology, and every school got their piece of that. We don't have anything to show for it today, meaningful, because it wasn't on a competitive basis. One school in my area built a school from the ground up to be Utah's first high-tech elementary school. They didn't know what they were doing, and it's a disaster. Every kid has a MacBook, but they are scoring 10 points below a neighboring school with identical demographics because they don't have any content. It was all about every kid having a device and avoiding the cost of textbooks, rather than what is it we want to achieve academically. So in Utah, we have now done it on a competitive basis, and as far as deploying software, for example, we have legislation for the state. We did ELL software. And we said, okay, what companies have the best ELL software to give these ELL kids intervention 45 minutes a day on headsets where they're getting one-to-one education we did it on a competitive basis, and now we have results, competitive results that show that ELL students are the highest growing students in the entire state of Utah, and it's attributed to this software that's available to every student. This year, we did K-3 early intervention software. 6 companies qualified. The schools got to choose which product they wanted in their schools, and now and by the way, we only had 30,000 licenses. In Utah, that's a lot, but that's a third of first grade and kindergarten students. We didn't want to provide it for everybody because then the schools wouldn't compete. They would take it as an entitlement, and it would sit on a shelf. So we let them compete, and now we're going to have a third-party evaluator hold them all accountable. So you have the interest of the schools, which said, pick us, we will deploy it optimally, we will have the correct professional development, we will have the correct dose rates that the manufacturer requires, and we'll have third-party evaluation to hold us accountable. And then in a year, we will see which products are actually producing, and that's how we're policing it.
Real briefly, can I
Sure,
just
oh, absolutely.
mention, our organization, we could spend a whole session on quality, has published 2 pieces of important work that have been adopted voluntarily by many states on their own, and the INACOL National Quality Standards for Online Courses, and that is a tool with 6 different sections of criteria to front-end evaluate online courses before offering them to students. In October, we published a second set of criteria for outcomes-based performance metrics to evaluate those courses based on student proficiency and student growth on the back end. Louisiana just passed out online course choice, and they're going to be doing both of those on the front end and on the back end.
And I believe Texas has adopted them, haven't they?
For the virtual school
Yeah. Yeah. And so for online, in order to teach in one of the courses, you do have to go through training that's been approved by INACOL. But I'm also talking about the one when you're in the classroom and it's blended and a teacher has a laptop or the kids have devices. It's the one area where we tend to just kind of, if we don't have enough money, we tend to just cut that off. And you're exactly right. If you do that, if you say, well, they'll just know how to do it. What we have found actually is that when you bring technology in the classroom, it magnifies the level of expertise of that teacher. A really good teacher does incredible things. A really bad teacher, things fall apart in their classroom. So it is something that they need coaches. Actually, CETA several years ago recommended that for every 1,000 students, you have one person who's that will service the teachers of those kids and help them learn. One of the things that we found out in the most recent Speak Up survey, the one that I was talking about earlier, is that teachers who use these devices on their own for their personal are more likely to use them in the classroom and are more likely to know how to use them instructionally. And then also, at one time, if federal dollars that came to the states and it was used for technology, 25% of that money was supposed to be spent on on professional development. So a quarter of the investment was training teachers on how to use it wisely. And I think what happens if you don't, then what you've done, you've purchased a very expensive word processor and calculator because the kids pretty much just use the laptop in their classroom because the teacher doesn't know what else to do with it or device. They just use it for taking notes or using a calculator, and that's a waste of huge investment. So please, whatever we do, we have to make sure we understand.
Thank you. Ms. Berglund, that question actually, you just addressed my question, but I'd like to ask it anyway. I'm a CIO for a rather large law firm in Houston. I'm an Oklahoma State University graduate student in information systems. I'm a huge advocate of an online classroom type situation where the professor shares notes and instructions. I have an iPad 3 with a sweet display. I have a Kindle. I don't even like those devices because and I've rolled a bunch of those out to my attorneys, and the iPad becomes an expensive toy. So I guess my question is, I like books, and what are your students' reactions? Are you getting blowback from not using books anymore?
Well, we certainly haven't moved away from using books in the state of Texas, but we are seeing progressively that students' opinions about reading online it's increasing, the number. That's one of the slides that I went through really quick. I think it was 30% last year would use the technology to read a book online, whereas maybe this year I think it was 45%. And I'm like you. My older sister is not technology literate at all, but she reads everything voraciously on her Kindle. I'm still wanting the paper. We call that the immigrant. But I will tell you, what changed it for me is using the Kindle app, because I found that with the technology, and that's another slide that I went through really quick, is that we've got to get to where mobile is a verb and not a device. So it doesn't matter if I'm using my iPad, my iPhone, my iPad, or my Kindle. I read a book on all three devices, and the device was smart enough to know where I'd left off on the other device. And that was a game changer for me. And then also, you know, how often have we, when we've been teaching reading, we know that if we can immediately get kids to understand what a word is when they struggle with the word, what do we used to do when I teach? The dictionary's in the back of the room. Well, how many got out of their seat and went to the dictionary? Now they can click on the word and they get the definition, or they can even go out on the internet and look up information. So, you know, that's a very important discussion to make sure that we know that when we're talking about digital, we're not talking about PDFs. We're talking about using the power of the technology to really enhance those teachable moments.
May I chime in on that? I agree with that 100%. Howard Gardner's work at Harvard on multiple intelligences has shown that we all have different types of learning styles in different situations. And rather than that two-dimensional bell-shaped curve that represents a classroom, it's actually, because of the different slices of ways of learning, it's a three-dimensional bell. And it's a lot more diverse, and we ought to be respecting the learner's preferred way of learning. And so for some kids, it may be listening to audiobooks. It may be, depending on the important thing is that we get the intelligence formed in the human brain, and it doesn't have to look a certain way. And that's why, for me, we're setting the captives free.
Yes. My name is Angie Chen Button. I'm a state representative, and I serve on the technology committee as a vice chair. So I'm just extremely appreciative and impressed by all your presentation. And I took pages of notes. And definitely a lot of things you talk about, I think we should discuss in the technology committee in order to help the public ed community to make things more efficient. And I'm so happy to see several of my ex-colleagues now as senators right here. Okay. Jennifer, I do have a little bit of concern for one of the top three challenges you mentioned, which are extremely important. But the second challenge you talk about, the broadband access, we might have to invite you to come to the technology committee to give us more briefing, because my understanding is during the interim charges and also last year, we talked about that in Texas, we're putting an extraordinary effort. Now our broadband access coverage is statewide is supposed to be around 97%. But you seem commented that is still the number 2 challenge you have. So there's some mismatch. It could be now the speed you're talking about. Can you elaborate a little bit? Thank you.
Well, I just spoke this week with Connected Texas, who helped put together that map. And the way those maps are created is they use census blocks. So if one person in that census block has high-speed internet, they color all of that block, the color that they give it credit. They give every single person that lives in that census block credit for having high-speed internet. So that's part of my concern with the way they're mapping it, is that I don't think it really tells us. Number one, it doesn't take into account how many devices, particularly in a school. When you start, every kid brings in a device, it just brings the network down immensely. But a lot of it has to do with the way they're doing it, and it's because it's the way the federal government told them to do it. It's not done by household. It's done by census blocks, so it's a little deceiving.
Yeah, I heard that complaint, so we might want to invite you to come back to give us more insight.
Okay, I'd love to. I would love to.
Utah has 100% of its schools connected to fiber now. We did it through the E-rate money. But the problem we're finding now is inside the schools, some of the schools actually, I've been in there, and where they have the fiber coming into the school, they have it now channeled through a PC. So they've narrowed it down to a cow trail. So now we need to do stuff inside the schools.
You know,
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
When I was with the federal government, in 1996, when they started E-Rate, they wanted, and there was no connectivity in school. They wanted a really easy way to measure the school's connections. So all the school had to do was to have a connection into the outside of the school. There was no measurement of anything inside. And when the federal government in 2005, when I was there, got to 99% of schools are connected to the internet, instead of asking a different question on the capabilities inside the school for learning, they stopped doing the study. So there is no information, and people say we've connected 100% of our schools to the internet. So that's part of the problem too. It comes back to the federal government problem, right?
Yes, sir.
All three of your presentations were terrific, but it was really interesting when Jennifer Berglund, at the very end of her presentation, mentioned about the broadband, that you've got to have it both for the schools and for the residential so the students can continue learning. I said, this is the key, because in Texas, our infrastructure on broadband is terrible. And I think that, that's the foundation we've got to lay before we can really shift from print to digital. And I'm really delighted to hear that Representative Button understands this. And this is something that I think once we lay that foundation of getting broadband the whole state, and I think the only state maybe that's got that is North Carolina, and their legislature mandated it back in over 10 years ago, and I've never figured out why we haven't done that here in Texas, because once that foundation is laid, I think we're just going to go gangbusters. And I was going to ask Senator Stephenson. I think you kind of alluded to it. Have you all had that same problem in Utah, and how are you addressing that in Utah to get more coverage on the broadband? Because I know you're just as spread out as we are here in Texas.
Yeah, we are. In our urban areas, we've got pretty good coverage, but actually the rurals, through the rural telecoms, have more money than the urban ones. So they typically have a lot more connectivity in some of but we've got a long way to go. We're counting on the private sector to step up, and we'd be interested to get suggestions from others on how to make that happen.
If you want to follow up, when I was in Arizona with Governor Hall, we tried to leverage the dollars that the state agencies were spending on telecom and try to provide multiple providers. We found that in the rural areas, in the CLEX, the cable network had lots of buried dark fiber that wasn't being used, and so we set up multiple categories of broadband, and then created like a buying club out of the agencies that the localities could also buy off of. We dropped the price of broadband in many rural areas in Arizona from over $1,000, $5,000 a month for a T1 line to under $500. And then the schools and the libraries and the police departments leveraged it. The number one buyer of telecom from the government was lottery in Arizona. So.
We are pressing on time, so we only have time for one more question, I'm afraid, and it's right here.
Thank you very much. I'm really a black and white guy, and on a spreadsheet, the only number that matters to me is in the bottom right-hand corner. And metrics is a big deal. I'm old enough to remember the disaster of the new math and the death of phonics. I would urge you to, I think, Senator, you were the only one that really gave any indication of the efficacy of this. I can't dispute that this is the way we're heading, but when you're trying to sell something, I think you need to provide the numbers of the good it's doing. Second, do you see all of that's good, and I know we're headed in that direction. Are we concerned about what you lose, socialization, cooperative learning, teams, playing, if you go to all this technical? Thank you.
To your last question first, what I'm finding is that this connects kids. When kids have these available in the class, during the class, they are finding out answers to things that are going on in the class. They're texting each other. they're texting others, and if a teacher can't cope with that, consider television today. You get all of these bands of information on sports stations, on news stations, everything's going, you're getting we need to accept this. Concerning the efficacy, that's why whenever we put an RFP out in Utah, we're requiring that a third-party evaluator publish the results of the effectiveness. That kind of transparency is essential. The problem we're having, though, is the LEAs and the State Department of Education are not cooperating with the third-party evaluators in providing the data for the cohorts of students that are involved in it. Sometimes we get as small a sample as 10%. We want the entire population of those students, their scores, so that we can tell that, and we're now working on legislation to make that happen. It's amazing how many ways there are to avoid reporting on this stuff.
All right, well, thank you all very much for attending today's panel on learning technologies. And once again, if you get a chance, please fill out the comment cards. We really appreciate the help. Leave them in your seats if you have them. Thank you all. Have a great lunch and close to the panel.